was the most calm, peaceful state I've ever experienced. Society kind of forces us into these different boxes. And then we tend to echo that. Growing up, we all put so many labels on ourselves.
The very act of giving yourself a definition is also the flip side, also limiting.
I don't want this daughter to have to go through that same cascade of life.
Moments of joy that you speak of, they're constantly there. You just have to really slow down and look for them.
A lot of people, and for me, a big issue is how many distractions do you have? Data is there. We just need to be able to make it known so people don't feel the stigma.
I think a lot happens when you get into that state of mind where you're just focused and you're zoned out of everything else that could be distracting, and I think people call it flow state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you get into flow state?
Doing a lot of linking my breath and body. So a lot of yoga, a lot of meditation. But when you say flow state, the specific memory that comes to mind is writing my book, because I remember sitting down, it was the middle of the pandemic, and I'm not like what I would call an advanced meditator by any means, and especially not then. But I remember just taking a few deep breaths for a few minutes, and then just something happened, and I just pen to paper, right? And just writing. And it felt like a really long time. But my entire first section of my book was written at my dining room table in this expansive creative state. Everything just kind of came to me easily. I didn't question my words or what I was saying or whether or not it would be understood. It just felt very natural, like it was coming through me. Yeah. And when I looked at the clock, it had only been 45 minutes. So when you say flow state, I haven't quite been able to capture the magic of that one moment. I'm just honoring that I had it in the first place.
I think that's right. I think for me, I'm just hoping and wishing like lightning strikes me and then I actually get some work done. And the rest of the time is waiting for the next lightning strike. But we have Dr. Anita Bangale here today. And it turns out I've actually known Anita for probably 20 years when she was in emergency medicine residency at GW. And Anita, you're here to tell us all about flow state, the science behind it, and some really cutting edge ways that we can help ourselves get into flow state. Welcome to the show, Dr. Bangale. How are you?
Hey, Dinesh. Hey, Seema. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here and share some of the insights on flow state.
Before we get into the substance today, tell us what we can't find out about you through your Instagram, through your TikTok, your website, your bio. Tell us who you really are and why you're talking to us today about flow state and how that can really help people move their lives forward at a time where it might just feel a little too sticky and frustrating for all of us.
Yeah, growing up, we all put so many labels on ourselves, right? Society kind of forces us into these different boxes. And then we tend to echo that and we tend to label ourselves as, oh, I'm an ER resident, or I'm a doctor, I'm a girlfriend, I'm a mom, I answer. But then somehow that's all we become are these labels and these names.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I like to do for myself and for other people is to help us realize our expansive creativity, our limitless potential, and for us to be able to understand that we are a source of light and energy, and there is really no limit and no number of labels that can truly define us.
It's so funny because I feel like that is not how I completely agree with you. And this is just complete polar opposite of how I used to think back when I was learning to doctor, right? All of this seemed really like fluff, but now there's so much science behind it, right? And it's from ancient scriptures or ancient knowledge, if you will, all the way through now that's really backing everything you said is actually very, very true and very concrete.
Yeah. And I think for me, that turning point was the exact same way, like what you're saying, Seema, where I believed in that checklist or the number of labels, the kind of adjectives that I could put after my name or describe myself as, I'm a physician or I'm somebody who's hardworking, even the adjectives, not even necessarily those nouns that come with it. And then I think when I had my first child, I realized I don't want this daughter to have to go through that same cascade of life,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
not that there was anything wrong because technically I had, quote, succeeded in that game. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I felt like we could feel more fulfilled. And I think that was really the catalyst behind wanting to think and read and learn about a different way of being.
Mhm.
Mhm.
When we talk about labels and identities, and this is a fairly recent concept for me to really buy into. I think about that. I think it's a meme where there's a circle and there's an ant that's walking around and it doesn't cross the line of the circle.
Yes.
And only in like the last decade or so have I come to realize, and I'm going to try my best to articulate it the way it's in my head. Things in my head make more sense than they do out in the world. Okay. So when we define ourselves, when we give ourselves a label, when we associate ourselves with an identity, we're often tricked into thinking that is expansive. But I've come to realize that the very act of giving yourself a definition is also the flip side, also limiting. And the way this came to be is I remember when we started the law firm in 2012 and new people were joining our firm, they'd say, what is your vision? How big do you want to get? And whatever number, the biggest number that I thought was unreasonable, and if I doubled it and I said, okay, we want to be 400 people, that sounds great in the moment, but it's also limiting. And that is such a mind bending thing to think about that if you say, I'm a lawyer or I'm a podcaster, you're also excluding all the other things,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
Talk to us more about that and how you came to that realization and why that is something that we urgently need to address and change.
Well, I think especially when you're talking to people who have a kind of a high achiever mentality, right? It's
Mhm.
almost like looking at the next milestone. Oh, when I hit this next milestone, when I hit this next goal. And maybe it's all internally motivated, right? To want to seek out that next milestone. So it's fine. But at the end of the day, going one step further. And at the end of that step, you feel this drop of energy because you've achieved it. But for so many students, and I see this in so many like high school students or college students, medical students, when they're just like trying to expand all this energy, put in all this effort towards getting to that next milestone. And then at the end of it, they're like, well, and then what?
Mhm.
It's like
Mhm.
as if that was supposed to be fully fulfilling, but they're only trying to achieve it just to get to that next milestone. So I just
Mhm.
feel like there's some other purpose beyond just hitting that next milestone. And I think for
Mhm.
me, it was when I was in the emergency department, mainly, and I enjoyed my shifts, but it was kind of like I was just working and releasing all these the cortisol and the adrenaline, and it was enjoyable. But then it felt like, how do I have the energy to keep doing this? Is this the end goal? Is this it? Like,
Mhm.
is this what I'm going to do for the next 30 or 40 years? Not that each day wasn't enjoyable, but it just seemed like, wait, I think that there is something more.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's what I feel like I want to be able to get into. And
Mhm.
sometimes when especially students feel like they're trying to do things for an application, and
Mhm.
sometimes that sense of achievement or excellence in what you look two-dimensionally on paper, right, for the
Mhm.
application purpose, you forget that you're an entire being three-dimensionally living, and it's more about
Mhm.
that satisfaction and fulfillment in how you feel in all your senses.
Society's set up this way too, right? And not to put blame or anything, but just more in recognition of we've created this paradigm of did I check off the box or not? Um, what boxes did you check off and how many boxes do I need to check off to make sure that I'm at par or better, quote unquote? And we often forget that who we are is so multifaceted and you cannot really describe to anyone who are you, that it is limiting in
Yeah.
that sense.
And
And
I think
so
if you asked any of the people I went to grade school with, if I would ever be here talking about like feelings and emotion, like you said, fluffy material, they would not recognize me, right? Because I was
mhm,
so checklist, so goal oriented, so focused on just achieving that this seems like a quite a paradox. But I actually think one for some people does lead to the next, right? When you start feeling like,
mhm.
no, there's something beyond this. There's something that's actually dissatisfying about that checklist mentality.
One way I have come to think of it, because at some level we're all practicing that. There's reason this Happy and Human podcast exists, and we're doing all the things. Is that for those of us that are ambitious and highly motivated, specialization and hyper specialization is really good to sort of blast you off and get you to a level of achievement, success, progress, whatever you want to call it.
Hmm.
But more recently, I'm seeing a lot more a movement after you've reached a certain level away from specialization and a re-engagement with generalization to develop ancillary tangential skills, contacts, or different avenues for breaking through a plateau, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
And I think that really lines up with your TED talk a little bit, right?
Yes, I think so much of what the emergency department has taught me is that being a generalist can actually be a good thing, right? People would come
Mhm.
in for anything and everything at any moment of the day, and we had to be able to create that rapport with them where they were trusting us, and we had to be specialized enough to be able to take care of it, but generalist enough to be able to um, address any situation. And so I agree with you that sometimes people are so focused on a narrow zone of specialization that they forget the general skills. And I think that's
Mhm.
kind of where we can get our neurobiology to work for us instead of
Mhm.
against us. And that's where I think that flow
Mhm.
state comes in, is that how do we actually have our neurobiology be our own ally? Because sometimes it's like we're
Yeah.
so focused and so narrow in what we're trying to learn that that creative potential, that expansive ability that we have, we don't get to actually seek it out and take advantage of it because we're just so
Mhm.
narrowly focused. And
Mhm.
so I think sometimes taking a step back actually can help us achieve that flow state.
Yeah. And I mean these their thought patterns, right, in our brains are so heavily uh wired in, and that unwiring all of that so that we can tap into flow state is a challenge. I had my yoga session this morning with my teacher, and we were working on the subtleties of this, and it's very difficult to unwire 40 plus years of checklisting, of going hard, like not not being at ease, right, being overly difficult with yourself, overly challenging with yourself, constantly saying it's not good enough. But I don't think for many of us, especially if you haven't, even for those of us who have experienced flow state, it's very difficult to really describe. So can you tell us, how is flow state actually defined generally, but then also what's happening in our bodies when we're in a state of flow?
Yeah, so flow state, I think a lot of people that are in the arts or sports can relate to, or like you had mentioned about a book, you can achieve a flow state, and anybody can achieve a flow state. It's just by being human, we can achieve a flow state. And I think that is what makes that level of consciousness that we have uniquely as humans so special. And so it's not like you need a special degree. You don't have to have achieved anything before in life to achieve a flow state. So that's what I want to first say, is that anybody can achieve a flow state multiple times a week, every day even. And so flow state is that sense when people may call it being in the zone, but it's a sense of where the time space continuum gets warped because you're completely mesmerized and wrapped up in attention, focus, concentration, and there is a sense of expanded creativity and awareness. And you are so in the moment that everything around you seems to simultaneously disappear, yet merge into one, if that makes any sense. And so
Mhm.
there's four stages of flow state. So the first is like what you're describing is a struggle. And sometimes people stop there. This is where so many of us stop because we know that cortisol is being released. It's a struggle, right? There has to be, like, based on whatever our skill level is, when we're trying to achieve a flow state, the challenge level has to be just slightly higher because we have to be able to achieve a little bit of a stretch, not to the point where we snap, but a little bit of a stretch so that we feel like we're being challenged because we actually crave a little bit of a challenge, right? We want to prove to ourselves that we can do something. And so, but sometimes in that struggle, we falter because it is uncomfortable. So as we start to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, being in that struggle, that initial phase, then we can almost start to detach a bit and enter that release state. That's the second phase, where we almost detach ourselves from the struggle, become an observer of ourselves in that, you know, in that challenge. And then we can start to see the potential and the possibilities expand. And that's when we can actually hit a flow state. So sometimes it does take 15, 20, 25 minutes to actually enter a flow state. So it does take patience. It does take the that sense of self-efficacy and that belief in ourselves that we can achieve. And then when
Mhm.
you're in the flow state, there is a huge release of endorphins, of dopamine, which helps increase our motivation to want to continue. It's almost like when you're
Mhm.
doing a crossword puzzle and you get one answer and then all of a sudden you get the next two or three. And it's because that sense of creativity, awareness, it is all merging together. And
Mm.
you are actually having that sense of self efficacy come true because you are succeeding. And so it's just a catalyst for even more and more success, or however you define it, just possibilities are coming. And then the last phase is the recovery phase. And that usually happens in sleep when the brain releases different waves to be able to help integrate that experience and help it become part of your long-term memory and integrate it into your daily life.
Okay. So, well, I have a comment and then I have a question.
Okay.
So, well, I guess this first part is a comment slash question too. When you talked about there's resistance,
Hmm.
right? That first stage. And my reflection of that is some days I sit down and it is really a struggle. 45 minutes went by this morning and it felt like all I did was struggle, right? Only to drop into it at the last, maybe whatever. And then, it was, I had to move on. But then there's other days where I sit down and it's really easeful and it just comes very naturally. So what I'm asking is it different for different people at different times? Even if it's just because it's easy one day doesn't mean it's going to always be that way. And it doesn't have a reflection as to how quote unquote good you are at dropping into flow state.
No, exactly. And I think I experienced this flow state. I tried to experience flow state when I dance because, it's kind of like when you're trying to do something and you're overthinking it, you're not going to
Mhm.
be able to hit that release stage, right? The struggle is there. I'm trying to learn the step, trying to do the things. But then when I release and just listen to the music and try and be in the moment, it flows more easily. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it is detaching, like paradoxically detaching from the experience a little bit to be able to enter the flow state. And a lot of times, like you're saying, the timing does matter because sometimes it depends on our natural circadian rhythm when we're naturally more energized. I'm more of a morning person. So I'll try and reserve like 60 to 90 minutes in the morning because I know that's when I can do my deep thinking work. And it's easier for me to hit a flow state then. You ask me to do something at 7 p.m., there is no way, even after 4 hours, that I'll hit a flow state. So it is, like you said, variable for each person and your energy rhythms.
Mm,
And sometimes it depends on how much you want to do the activity, right? Like how is it is the struggle factor so high because it's something you don't want to do? How can you
mm-hmm,
reframe it so that it's something that you actually want to do?
mm-hmm.
And I think for
Okay.
a lot of people, and for me, a big issue is how many distractions do you have? I can't
Mm.
have my phone in the same room. I cannot have any other tabs open on my computer. Usually I hit a flow state with pen and paper. And for me, that's what works the best because I have the least distractions.
Mm. And then you said something about sleep. So you can be in a state of flow, but then it's not quote unquote complete until hours later you go to bed and then your brain does brain things and your body does the body thing and it integrates it all, correct?
Exactly. So there's
Okay.
different brain waves. So like for example, in that flow state we were talking about, the third stage of flow, which is that flow stage, there's gamma waves going on in the brain. And before, they used to actually think that the gamma waves were just like extra noise. They didn't know exactly why our brain needed gamma waves. And they found that the gamma waves are kind of high energy signals. And that has been associated with that release of dopamine, of the endorphins in the flow stage. And then in that recovery phase, which is happening when we sleep, we see a release of the delta waves, and that helps really integrate it all. And so it is really cool to see how the brain and the mind are actually connected in this, right? Because we see physiologic changes, even though we feel the changes too, there really are physiologic changes happening in the brain as well.
If you could have a one-on-one conversation with someone who's listening to this, and you just get to speak, they don't get to speak back, what would you say to someone who is entirely dismissive of this and thinks it's a luxury? I've got work to do. I've got the lawn to mow. Like, I'm just not interested. And more so from a perspective of, I don't need to stretch more. I don't need to push myself. Like, there is some merit in saying that, you've got to be content with what you have. And you can't just be chasing the next thing. You'll never, achieve your full potential. What would you say to that person? And what is the downside for completely just dismissing flow state as a luxury for elite athletes or a luxury for people who have, you know, very intensive careers or things like that? And I'm just, middle management, I'm a real estate agent, whatever. And if I have some free time, I want to play fantasy football, I want to watch football, I want to go out drinking with my buddies. I don't need to push myself.
I I think what I would say is think back to one of the most cherished memories that you have. And I could probably guarantee either that level of endorphin release that they're probably thinking, like in a nostalgic way that they're associating with that memory, there was probably some element of a flow state i- associated with that memory because it was either something that they were so proud to have achieved or so proud to have thought of or so proud to have created. Even if it's with a team, we know that there's flow states that can be achieved in or group dynamics.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so I would venture to guess for that person that maybe their level of fulfillment even higher if they were able to tap into that flow state again. And sometimes people know that they can achieve a flow state, they just don't know that they have. And
Yeah.
sometimes when they can think back to these memories, they may realize, oh, actually, I had this amazing idea when I was just taking a shower, right? Because
Yeah.
usually there we're not distracted, or when I was taking a walk in nature, and maybe they have entered the flow state. And so linking it with their previous success would probably help drive that desire.
Yeah, I love that answer. And it actually resonates with me a lot because it reminds me of sort of a core belief I have. And this is particularly to me, is that, that dreaded, I feel stuck. I'm not sure what I'm doing. I feel a little lost. I believe that that sort of surfaces for all of us when we are taking a comfortable path
Hmm.
and we're sort of just staying stagnant. And it's not that we're really stuck. Like we say, I'm stuck, but it's not that we're stuck, is that we feel stuck simply because we aren't challenging ourselves, simply because we haven't set our sights on something that's a little bit out there
Yeah.
that we feel connected to. And I would say that that's at stake is if, you don't have to admit it to us, but if you're going to bed and you're like, I just don't know what to do anymore. I feel stuck. I don't feel like this is working for me. The answer probably lies something in what Dr. Bangale just said. It's that you're
Mhm.
not tapping into your highest abilities to push yourself a little bit.
Yeah. And I
Mm.
would say that sometimes it's a creative phase that maybe you don't think is going to be rewarded based on society's expectations of normal success,
Mhm.
right? Or productivity. So, for example, in the height of COVID, and I was, working full time in the emergency department, that's when I decided to somehow pursue my coaching certification. And probably it was because I just knew that I needed some other outlet.
Mhm.
And but it's not like I had time or energy, but I, like you're saying, there was something, I needed something else. I was feeling stuck otherwise, right? And I needed
Yeah.
to expand somehow. And it's almost like when you open a portal and you realize there's this whole other world out there. And I think
Yeah.
that's what the flow state can help people achieve. It's like, let me just
Mhm.
tap into this little window and you see this entirely new universe.
Mm.
Yeah.
One thing you really talk about when you're talking about flow state is ketamine.
Yes.
Talk to us about ketamine. It's been used for years, but for people who don't have a medical background, tell us what is it traditionally used for, and what does it have to do with flow state?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm really happy that you asked because people may feel like, what is the connection? So with ketamine, it's been FDA approved as a medicine for anesthesia for more than 50 years. And in the emergency department, I personally used it for the past 19 years to be able to, like, say, a 2-year-old comes in with a broken bone. We'll give them ketamine to help sedate them, to be able to put the bones back in place, or to be able to give medicine to people before we're intubating them, right? So to be able to help kind of with creating an altered level of consciousness. Now, in terms of how we treat it for use it for treatment resistant depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, migraine, um, chronic pain, it's the medication is the same, but the dosing is totally different. So it's very low dose ketamine. And at low doses, what's been found is that during the ketamine experience, so first either we inject it directly in the muscle or we place an IV and use it as a 40-minute infusion. And people are actually on when they're looking at the EEGs, we're seeing those gamma waves appear again. Those same waves that people have on their brain scans when they're in a flow state. And so that's when we see that rapid awareness, that increased sense of curiosity, awareness, and integration of all the senses coming together. And so that's why ketamine can be so helpful, because what it actually does at a like neurotransmitter level is that it blocks a certain receptor, the NMDA receptor, and that causes glutamate to increase. Well,
Mm.
glutamate is the most prevalent neurotransmitter in the brain. So a lot of times we think about like dopamine or serotonin, right? The way that a lot of other antidepressants work, but glutamate is the one that's most prevalent. So that's why it's so helpful for people that have treatment resistant mood issues, depression or anxiety in particular, because it is the most prevalent neurotransmitter. So if we can make a change with that,
Mm.
then it can help so many people. And
Mm.
the reason it actually helps is that it creates new bridges. So it helps by working through neuroplasticity, by creating new pathways of connectivity in the brain.
Mm.
Mm.
And that allows, and what's happening during that ketamine experience is patients are achieving that flow state.
Talk to us about the migraine part. I've been having migraines since I was 9 years old. What is the connection with ketamine and how has it helped with migraines?
So similar to the other pathways, because it helps so much with increasing glutamate, and glutamate is that most commonly present neurotransmitter, excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain, it can help with the perception of pain. And so migraine, like other, issues related to pain or other chronic pain conditions, it can just help with that perception of pain. And so that's how it can be quite helpful. And we've seen studies done through Yale, Columbia, many different institutions, the VA. And so the data is there. We just need to be able to make it known so people don't feel the stigma if they do want to
Mm.
seek out this treatment.
Mm.
So you offer ketamine therapy
Yes.
in your practice.
Yes.
Talk to us about, first of all, the the way you use ketamine. Is it for patients who are experiencing these varieties of things like the depression, the anxiety, the migraines, and also feeling stuck, or are you focused particularly on one area? Talk to us about how you use it.
Yeah. And So the reason this all came, that I was so interested in this is that there are studies done that show up to 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 patients that come to the emergency department actually are coming in because of some underlying anxiety or depression related issue. So when people
Mhm.
are coming in with like headache, let's say abdominal pain, chest pain, maybe there's underlying anxiety and depression. And so sometimes I would feel the shift leaving like, okay, I had a perfect chart, but I didn't really truly feel like I was able to tell the patient what was wrong with them. I didn't really feel that level of connection.
Mhm.
About 8 or 9 years ago, I started working with a telepsychiatry group online where we treat patients with anxiety and depression. And I realized that so many people between the ages of like 25 and 50 had symptoms of clinical depression and anxiety, but
Mhm.
didn't necessarily need oral medications, or oral medications had so many side effects that were actually making their symptoms worse.
Mhm.
And so when I started reading about ketamine, I realized that this was a medicine that can be given just a few times as an induction, like 6 sessions as an induction. And then so many, like up to 80% of people were having relief of symptoms. And so I
Mhm.
thought the data was so strong for something that didn't need to be taken forever, unlike
Mhm.
a lot of other oral medications. And so in our practice, I usually offer it for patients that have treatment resistant depression, anxiety, PTSD, OCD, migraines. And then I will talk to patients that are having a lot of, certain blocks. Usually, sometimes underlying it, there may be some type of anxiety at the core of it. But that's why we do use a lot of coaching integration, therapy integration to be able to make the changes last, because it's not like you're
Mhm.
coming in, you get a shot, we say bye. It's
Mhm.
a whole process.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Interesting. So you have like a therapist working with each of these patients if that's what they need.
Right. So I do the coaching sometimes, and we have certain NPs that are psych NPs that can work with them, on the therapy side.
A lot of stigma around mental health, just to begin with. There's a lot of stigma around having PTSD or OCD or things like that. And I still think a lot of people think those are heavy words to the point where
Mhm.
they don't want to have an official diagnosis in their chart or things like that. Uh, talk to talk to the person or talk to us um, who says, "I'm not a prisoner of war. I don't have PTSD. I haven't gone through anything traumatic. I like to put my keys in the same spot. Doesn't mean I'm OCD." Talk to the regular person, I would say, and maybe regular is not the word, but someone who doesn't identify with any of those types of diagnoses or labels. And is a ketamine treatment still something that folks should seek out? And if it is, how do we do sort of that self litmus test to say, that could be me? I mean, I feel anxious when certain things happen, but I don't have anxiety, right?
Yeah, and I think it's okay. Like, you don't have to label yourself as having anxiety. I think if you're able to function and you feel like your day-to-day activities are not being affected, then a certain level of anxiety is good, right? Like sometimes anxiety gets a bad reputation for being something that we don't want to be associated with at all. But anxiety can actually be motivating. It can actually be a good thing. That the way that we have a little bit of anxiety before taking a test, it can actually be good to have a little bit of anxiety or stress. But I would say, if you want to just have an initial session where we talk through things, we understand the deeper aspects, because sometimes if there's an element of not wanting to acknowledge the effect the anxiety is having in your life, then sometimes talking to a coach or therapist can just hold up a mirror where you're actually able to self-reflect and actually really able to assess truly
Mhm.
what is the level of magnitude that the anxiety is having on my day-to-day life, on my relationships. Because maybe you're super productive at work, but maybe your relationships are suffering because of the anxiety. So how,
Mhm.
I think it's more, let's just dissect it a little bit more. It doesn't mean that we have to label you, but if
Mhm.
upon dissecting it, you're able to say, hey, actually, maybe there'll be a little bit of a benefit from me having a bit of that ego dissociation that can sometimes happen during the ketamine experience, then maybe it could be of benefit.
The thing that's happened with many, many, many of us is this phenomenon called masking, right? Where we've become so accustomed actually to that state of overperforming, hyperachieving, that it becomes the norm, right? And the body even gets acclimated to that heightened cocktail of stress hormones and inflammatory mediators and things like that, to where that actually feels normal.
Right.
And so, as you're sharing, I'm really just thinking back even to my own experience this morning with my yoga therapist, and how I got into a pose. Like, we had to slow it down, and he was telling me, like, just feel like where you're loading your body. And we had this whole like exchange back and forth about, you can see very clearly how that actually is reflective of how my perceptions are of the world. Right. And so I think it's so interesting. The reason I bring that up is because it's so subtle, right? The
Yeah.
masking that happens is so subtle. I didn't realize that I was like forcing my leg into a specific position, and, that was creating instability in the rest of my body. So it's just really, really interesting to hear you talk about how there's this solution out there that will help make that masking, will become more aware of it.
Yeah.
And kind of help have assistance to dismantle it a little bit, because it's what I'm hearing you say is that it's not serving.
Exactly. Because I think the key is like in a deeply meditative state also, right? We're kind of so in the zone, but it helps we bring that awareness from that deeply meditative state back into our regular day-to-day life, right? And we'll probably feel a little bit more calm, a little bit less tense. And sometimes we get focused on the process during meditation or during like ketamine therapy, right? Because we're focused on the process, the experience, as opposed to like what you're talking about with the yoga on just the results, right? We're so sometimes results and performance focused on achieving the right answer or the expected pose. And it doesn't matter how we get there. Ketamine helps break it down into, let's focus on how we're getting there. Let's focus on how we're going to actually achieve this result that we want. And maybe it is a little bit outside of the box, and it doesn't have to follow a certain formula.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the other thing, right? Like, just a little, sorry, you mentioned this, and I have to get on my soapbox a little bit about the yoga, because our perception of what that means even is so performance based. And it's actually not. It's actually about all the subtleties that you just mentioned, right? And I love that you are talking about how, um, there are out of the box ways of doing things, or non-traditional ways of doing things, ways that have are different from the more popularized ways of getting from point A to point B, that are worthy of consideration.
And back to just my role as a mom and not wanting my
Yeah.
children to feel, or like the next generation of children to feel like there's only one way of doing things. Because when we do look at the mental health struggles, right, we just do see so many people of this younger generation feeling the strain of the comparison game. And I just want them to know there's multiple ways. And if they can enter their own flow state, they can be happy in their own process. And it doesn't matter if they're getting external validation from society. Because they're
Yeah.
just joyful because of all those endorphins, all the everything that's released in their own state, that you're not even aware necessarily of the judgment from the outside.
Yeah. Feel good, do good, right? I mean, I think your performance, your ability to succeed, and your ability to do and be with the people around you can go exponentially higher if you're not always looking over your shoulder or carrying around a backpack that's weighing you down. So I have a on the spot question for you.
Yeah.
Have you tried ketamine?
Yes. So actually I did. So before we opened our clinic, we were just getting everything prepared, and, all the medications and getting everything set up in the office. And so before we actually had our first patients, I had my nursing staff, we had a couple of tests patients. And so I was one of them because I wanted to, one, make sure that everything felt very safe and that the monitoring and everything was 100%, on target. And I was very curious what the experience was like because I also wanted to be able to share with my patients what the experience was. Because having never done any illicit drug, having never done marijuana, I'd never had like a psychedelic experience in my life. So I really didn't know what to share apart from anecdotes in the data.
Mhm.
But I have to say that it was like a transcendental experience in that it was the most calm, peaceful state I have ever experienced. And
Mm,
there is this feeling of just attachment and one with the universe that since I've done it, basically all my patients have felt that similar experience as
mhm.
well. And
Mhm.
so I think so much of it has to do with safety, though, right
Yeah.
dose, right protocol, right monitoring, appropriate setup. So having somebody in person there, this is not something that should be done at home where you're not
Sure.
being monitored, and I always say that is that just because we have this available, it's a tool and it has to be used in the correct way. And so much of it has to do with safety and monitoring.
Mm.
Mm.
I love that you talked about that. What does it feel like afterward? Are patients safe to get in the car and drive home themselves? What's the landscape look like?
Yeah, so for the first 6 sessions, it's an induction phase. So you do usually 2 or 3 sessions a week for 2 or 3 weeks. And then usually their maintenance phase is about once a month for 6 to 12 months. It really just depends on how the patient is doing, their symptoms. But in no situation should the patient drive after, regardless of whether
Okay.
they're induction or maintenance. In the induction phase, we start with a weight-based protocol. And so we start at a certain dose. We watch how the patient tolerated that. Did they feel comfortable? Were they a little bit scared? Did they not feel anything? And then based on that, we adjust the dose. And so there's certain protocols, and we follow those. And then we monitor their blood pressure the whole time, oxygen, um, heart rate, respiration rate. And then, but in terms of safety, usually it's somebody either dropping the patient off and then picking them back up again to drive them home, um, or the patient driving and then arranging some type of transportation. But because of
Mm.
the medication and the fact that it is altering your level of consciousness,
Hmm.
it's not safe to drive at all.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay. And you said that this happens, like it's not a one and done thing. It is carefully guided, but the goal is to help you retrain your brain to where then you don't need that,
Mm.
right?
Right. So what happens with ketamine is that I touched upon the word neuroplasticity before, but basically that is our brain's ability to rewire at any stage. So literally up until the second we die, our brain can rewire itself. And so what ketamine does is if you think about anxiety or depression or even like let's say pain or migraine as a spiral, a loop of trigger and action, right? Like this is what happens, so I get a migraine. This is what happens, so I'm feeling quite anxious. Well, our brain loves habits, right? It just goes down the path of least resistance. So when it's following this loop and this spiral, it's not doing it because our mind wants it to. Even if our mind doesn't want it to, it's just because that's what's easiest. It's preserving energy. But with ketamine, what's happening is we are literally building little dendrites onto our neurons, onto our brain cells. And that helps new pathways happen. So instead of going down that same pathway, it decides to take a new pathway. And
Mm.
it's because it's like a muscle, you have to build it at a certain intensity, frequency. It's like weights, right? You can't just like
Yeah.
build abs or
Mhm.
biceps by working out once a month. So that's why that
Well,
induction session happens like 2 or 3 times a week.
I figured out I've been doing my abs all wrong. I do one
Yeah.
sit up a year
Yeah.
and no six pack shows up.
Yeah. We must have read that same protocol. That's not working.
Yeah, it's not working.
Yeah.
Oh, man. This is so fascinating. And, why don't more people, just as a final question here before we move to our wrap up, why don't more people know about this?
So, for one thing, I think that it gets a lot of negative attention. And just based on Matthew Perry and kind of what's been in the news recently, I think that we know that this is something that requires a huge amount of supervision and safety. I think any medications, especially when they have been associated with any illicit medication like any psychedelics, right? Whether it's mushrooms or LSD, and there's just obviously going to be such a negative connotation associated with it. But I think what people don't have necessarily is that curiosity to try and understand and dig little bit deeper. But I'm surprised by the number of people who do actually know about ketamine. I think because
Mm,
people, when they are feeling like their medications currently are not working, or they're just like, yeah, I'm taking the medicine, it's helping me feel a little bit better, but I read about this thing. And so these things are showing up on the blogs, they are showing up online. And so I think it's really beneficial to actually talk about it from the knowledge and expertise that we have coming from the medical background, as opposed
hmm
to just like, oh, let me get this on the street and try something, right?
hmm
That's where the stigma comes in, and that's kind of what we need to try and correct.
Dr. Bangale, Anita, you're such a wealth of knowledge. And, I think we all can do better with a little bit of flow state, especially as, we're approaching this sandwich generation that we've talked about before, Seema, where
Yeah.
the demands on our time are so much that, we feel like we're trapped between our obligations as parents and as children and work responsibilities and things like that. And what tends to go by the wayside is um, our own wellness and our own, you know, uh, health and mental state and things like that. And before you know it, you look up and you're well into your 50s or 60s. And at that point, the thoughts of it's too late starts to set in. And this is just the way I am. And that's the way, those are the cards that were dealt to me. So thank you for coming on here and sharing about your work
No
and all of that.
problem.
That's awesome.
And I'll just say that if we all feel like we don't have enough time or energy, but the flow state allows that time and energy to multiply. And so
Yeah.
I think it's even more important for us as a sandwich generation to dig deep and try and seek out those opportunities.
Yeah. You mentioned in one of your TED Talks too, social prescription, right?
Yes,
Like, which kind of touches on this, the idea that it doesn't have to be ketamine and
right.
it doesn't have to be you trying to sit there and force yourself into a quote unquote meditative state or an upside down yoga pose. Like, that's not what we're talking about. You talk about simple things like listening to your favorite music, the way your patient, you described your patient
Mhm.
in the TED Talk, or um, even going out and just how important it is to do the things that you love doing. If it's playing the guitar or cooking a particular type of food or learning how to make pottery, whatever it is that really feels like you want to explore more, if it lights you up inside, all powerful ways to achieve flow state. And the benefit that you're getting is a more toned nervous system that's able to withstand the stresses of life without just completely toppling over, right? You've better health, better sleep, better connection, more meaning in your life, healthier relationships, all of these wonderful things. So I'm so excited that you came on here and talked about ketamine, because it's something that I personally had not known a lot about, other than its traditional uses. So
Yeah.
excited.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, it's all think part of like an abundance of resilience when we tap into our hobbies and our social prescription.
Mhm.
And for some people who have more treatment resistant symptoms, ketamine is another way of achieving it. But yeah, absolutely. You don't need that to achieve the flow state.
It's time to play or participate in our one of a kind, world famous Happy and Human podcast wrap up segment. How
Oh,
do you feel?
this is a good time for me to excuse myself. No, just kidding.
No, no. Our listeners they stay the entire show just to get to this part because I think we secretly torment and torture our guests with this part. So tell us from all of your lived experience, whether it's related to your work at the Woodlands or as an ER doctor or as a mom of three beautiful girls, tell us one thing that we all can do today without a doubt to make our lives slightly better from your experience.
Say on a moment where you just close your eyes and think back to a moment where you felt joy
Mm.
and use it as a dress rehearsal for the next time that you're going to feel that way. Because it's almost like you put your brain through that experience. And so you're more likely to make it happen again. And I just think
Yeah.
every one of us probably is seeking that.
Yeah.
Mm.
Especially at the Happy and Human podcast. We are seeking to be happy and we're seeking to be human. So that's a good one.
So good. Oh my gosh. I'm just thinking of this one time Monsi and I were driving home, and it was dark, and there's all this construction right in North Austin, and there's these office buildings that are being put up faster than we can say atom. And um, one of them had a light, right? And the neon sign was on, but it was like, I don't know, Lakshmi Beauty or something.
Wow.
But the beauty part of the sign just kind of was flickering in and out. And I saw it and it was like just so in my own, like, it's late, I'm tired, I want to get home, and I'm just driving. And Mansi goes, Mommy, look at that sign over there. And I'm looking and I'm like, yeah, I see it, like, what? And she goes, this is just the funniest thing I've seen all day. Beauty, 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 beauty. Like, just every time the words lit up, she would say beauty, and we were just in a matter of seconds just laughing hysterically. And the reason I share that story is because these moments of joy that you speak of, they're constantly there. You just
Yeah.
have to really slow down and look for them.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
I know.
this is why kids are so amazing.
No, it's true. Like I got so frustrated with my 7-year-old yesterday, and I was like, you're just like eating this junk food. I asked you to eat the carrots, so they're left on the table, and then now you're upstairs playing Legos. And so then I come downstairs, and then she sets a little card on my like next to my computer, and then she like slips it towards me, and so I read it, and it's like this 2-page letter. And it
Wow.
says, I
Oh,
know that I was like not doing the things I should have been doing, but I just love my Legos. And she was like, and also I had another question. Do you think that you're still going to be my best friend? Because I really hope that you do. I'll even go on a walk with you. And it was like one of those, like, okay, fine, you didn't eat your carrots. Right? Like, but it was just, yeah, it's like one of those moments you're just like, okay, this moment, I guess I am glad I had that negative moment to experience this right now. But yeah, it
so
was
good.
sweet.
There's always a flip side, right? There's
Yeah.
always an opportunity or a gift. And
Yes.
it's so good. Okay, so this is my favorite part actually of the show, which is called Ask It Forward. So for listeners,
Okay.
if you're tuning in for the first time, Anita, you know exactly what's going to happen here. But we had a previous guest leave a question for you. You're going to answer it. And
Okay.
you then, after that, get to ask a question for the next guest, not knowing what we're going to talk about. Even, I don't even think Dinesh and I are aware of when we're recording next at this point. We've had so many incredible people asked to come on the show, so we've been pretty busy. This question
Mhm.
has been left for you from Anu Sehgal, who is an incredible happy human. She founded the Culture Tree and is really trailblazing, creating grassroots cultural initiatives that expand into DEI initiatives and bringing awareness and celebration of various Indian culture throughout the tri-state
Awesome.
area. Her question to you was, how do you make what you do a domino effect?
Really good question. What I do is help people realize their true potential. And I think that brings me so much joy in helping others. And I think when people start their true potential and their true ability, they're able to help others. Because I think that is actually our true full potential, is in being able to
Mhm.
help guide others. And I don't think that there's any limit on it. So just because I help one doesn't mean I can't help more. And that next
Mm.
person can then go on and help the next person. And so
Mhm.
I think when we feel that inner fulfillment as we guide each other, it just leads to an entirely lit world of people that are self realizing and actualizing their dreams. And
Mm.
Mhm.
so I think it just means that I just have to keep showing up, and I just have to, sometimes like we were talking about earlier, we don't realize if we're speaking into an abyss or who's listening or if it matters. And I think that's a great question for me, almost like the universe is speaking to me to just keep going and just keep showing up.
Yeah.
I love that. I know Anna will be thrilled when she hears this, that her question inspired some wonderful introspection for you.
Yeah.
What is your question for our mystery guest?
Okay. Well, let's see. What is the most impactful compliment you've received?
I like that. And listeners, we always ask you guys to reflect on this yourself. This is not just for the happy and human guests. These questions are for everybody. Because you just never know what might unlock and help you kind of shed what was weighing you down. So
Yeah.
so
We
good.
can go all the way back, right? Because I think the most impactful comment I've ever received is that you have nice hair. But I have to go way back to find that comment, like compliment. So it's not just like in the near past, right?
Right. Yep. Past
Good.
lives. Yeah.
I love it. Okay, cool. So, we want to find a way to thank our guests. And one of the ways that we can show our appreciation for you taking the time out of your busy day to spend some time with us and share the work you're doing is to allow our guests an opportunity to share a cause or organization that is near and dear to their heart. And on behalf of you, Seema and I will make a contribution to that organization and hopefully share with listeners a cause that they may not be aware of, but also in some small way have folks benefit from the time we've spent because you've shared so much with us, and there's no way we can thank you for all that you shared. So we'd like to give you the opportunity to share with us an organization or a cause that you feel compelled to contribute to.
Amazing. First of all, I think that's such an incredible way to thank the guests. Like I think that is just a true domino effect that you guys have in doing it this way. So thank you. Very, very
Thank you.
grateful. So the foundation that means a lot to me is it's a relatively new foundation. It's called Run for Jeev, RUN for Jeev, JEEV, and their vision is to bring mental health awareness to young adults. And to start the conversation that mental health is not a stigma. And it's in honor of Sanjeev Panja, who lived here in the Woodlands and was a student at UT when he died by suicide a couple of years ago. And his family still lives here. And they started this in honor of their son because they had like a home life that seemed, quote, normal, right? He was, anytime I saw him, he was a happy go lucky kid, always laughter, like infectious sense of humor and laughter. And so I would really want to be able to shine his light forward. They have a 5K every year. I think this is going to be like the third year that they're doing it. And so they're kind of still getting started off the ground. So that would mean a lot to me and I know to them as well.
We would love to do that. Houston folks or non-Houston folks, you can sign up to run in the marathon or in the 5K.
Yeah, and it's a run/walk, so all ages, abilities.
Yeah. It's
Yeah, I think it's
incredible.
coming up on December 1st,
Yes.
2024. I'm at the website and I'm looking at it. So
Awesome.
thank you for sharing that. We would like to, we're grateful to be part of Sanjeev Panja's memory and would be happy to contribute to Run for Jeev.
Thanks so
Yes.
much.
We can't get enough of you, but I know our listeners won't be able to get enough of you either. Where can they connect with you?
So I have my private practice office in the Woodlands, which is a suburb in North Houston. And you can find information about that on my website. It's www.anitabangale.com. And, or you can check out my brand new TikTok. I literally have only done 3 of those, but it's been a lot of fun. And it's called the Woodlands Mind Spa. The name of my practice is the Woodlands Wellness and Mind Spa. Check out my Instagram. It's at Anita_Bangale_. And then there's other platforms I'm on and that I'm not really that active on, things like LinkedIn. So you can find me in a lot of different places.
And of course, your TED Talks, right?
Oh, yes. And then there's like 2 TED Talks, and they have separate links. One is from Breckenridge and one is from Raleigh.
We'll have all of this gold information put into the show notes so listeners, you can access it anytime. Thank you so much for coming on.